We're on the way to Tupelo, Mississippi to try and locate the grave of Jesse Garon Presley, the infant twin brother of Elvis Presley. From there we'll go to the Civil War town of Holly Springs and explore its Civil War history. Then we'll go to the Hillcrest Cemetery to find the grave of little Mittie Manning, whose mother refused to allow her daughter's body to be buried underground. Our next stop will be Sanatobia and the grave of country music star O.B. McClinton. From there we'll travel down Highway 55 to Ridgeland to visit the grave of Mississippi's daughter, Mary Ann Mobley, Miss USA and movie star. Her husband, Gary Collins, TV host, is also there. From Ridgeland we'll go to Meridian, to the grave of country music founder Jimmie Rodgers, known as the Blue Yodeler and the Singing Brakeman. Then we hop down to Laurel, where we visit the resting place of Thomas William Lester, who played Ebb on Green Acres. Then we travel down Highway 49 from Hattiesburg to Bond to see the grave of St. Louis Cardinals great pitcher Dizzy Dean. Then we'll go all the way up to Smithville to see the grave of Grand Ole Opry comedian Rod Brasfield. So here we go. We're on our way to Tupelo. On January the 8th, 1935, in this two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, Jesse Garon Presley was born to Vernon Elvis and Gladys Love Presley. To give you an idea of what it was like, this is the way it was then, a simple row of shotgun houses. Vernon had borrowed money to buy materials to build a house, hoping to finish it by the time Gladys gave birth to twin boys. He was running late and got his dad and uncle to help him finish it. Unfortunately, little Jesse Garon was stillborn. The family had little money, so Jesse was placed in a shoebox and buried at Priceville Memorial Cemetery, not far from the house as the crow flies. 30 minutes after Jesse's birth, his twin brother Elvis Aaron Presley was born. Here's Elvis around the age of 8 with his mother and dad. Vernon worked odd jobs, which was hard to find because the Depression wasn't really over until the beginning of World War II. He spent 8 months in prison for altering a check, so Gladys and Elvis moved in with their relatives until Vernon returned home. When you get to the Pricefield graveyard, you can drive through the small gate and go until you come to a dugout place in the bank, where you can turn around. Walk up the hill, and on the left start looking for the black tombstone of Noah Presley. Little Jesse is on the right. Noah is Vernon's daddy's brother, so he would be Jesse and Elvis's great uncle. Susan is Noah's first wife. Noah actually took Gladys and Elvis to visit Vernon when he was in Parchment. When he returned home, Vernon decided to take his family to Memphis for a new start, and as they say, the rest is history. We're now on our way to Holly Springs to visit the grave of little Mittie Manning, whose mother refused to see her daughter buried underground. But first, it's hard to go to Holly Springs without telling the importance it played during the Civil War. This is one town that gave the South 13 Confederate generals. On November the 29th, 1862, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Holly Springs and set up a base camp and supply depot. This was to help his land campaign to capture Vicksburg. But on December the 4th, General Grant moved south to Oxford. 2 days later, his wife Julia and their 4-year-old son Jesse, along with Miss Grant's family slave, Julie, yes, I said along with Miss Grant's personal slave, Julie, arrived in Holly Springs. General Grant had his wife and son follow him throughout most of the war so that he could see them every once in a while. He left a message for Julia saying that he was sorry to have missed her, but General Grant's aide-de-camp, Captain Theodore Bowers, secured the home of Confederate Colonel Harvey Walter, who had moved his family to Alabama for their security. However, the Walters had left a friend, Mrs. Pugh Govan, in charge of the house. When Mrs. Grant arrived, she was welcomed by Mrs. Govan, and they became friends. Julia stayed on the bottom floor in the room on the far left. She described Mrs. Govan as a fine, noble woman, as a lot of Southern women are, she said. Stories say that Colonel Walters offered General Grant the use of his home. After all, he was raised in Ohio and came to Holly Springs at the age of 19 because his wife was from here. He was always against secession. He had become an attorney and president of the Mississippi Central Railroad before the war. On December the 20th, 1862, Confederate General Earl Van Dorn captured Holly Springs. He destroyed millions of dollars of supplies he couldn't carry with him, interrupting Grant's plans to take Vicksburg by land. When General Van Dorn heard that Grant and his wife had been staying at Walter House, he sent Colonel John Griffin and 10 men to check the house. The story goes that Mrs. Govan met the soldiers at the gate and persuaded Colonel Griffin to allow her to keep the personal baggage of Mrs. Grant and send it on to her later, she said. Julia wrote years later that she had left to meet her husband a couple of days before Van Dorn arrived. Other stories say it would be embarrassing for the wife of the Union top general to have his wife captured by the enemy and then let her go. Some believe that Mrs. Govan hid Julia and company so she could not be found. Other stories say that she was found, but General Van Dorn let her go. I'm inclined to believe the latter, because when General Griffin arrived at Walter Place, he found Mrs. Grant's personal carriage still there, along with the horses that pulled her carriage, and soon after found all of Mrs. Grant's baggage. We do know that Colonel Griffin ordered her carriage burnt and confiscated her horses, according to orders not to leave anything the enemy might be able to use. However, he left her personal baggage untouched, and it was later returned to Mrs. Grant. After the war, Colonel Walters and family moved back to the house. But 12 years later, Walter and his 3 sons died from the yellow fever epidemic in 1878. The house will remain in the family for over 100 years. In 1983, Mike Lynn, general manager of the Minnesota Vikings football team, bought Walter Place for a reported $11 million. It is said that up until that time, it was the most ever paid for a home in Mississippi. After Mike passed away in 2012, his wife Georgia auctioned off furnishings and valuables, and in 2014 placed the house up for sale. The house remained empty until 2019, when Terry Cook from Memphis bought Walter Place and renovated the house and grounds so that people could visit and have weddings at this historical old home. We have now arrived at the Hillcrest Cemetery in Holly Springs. We're looking for what was the grave of 4-year-old Mittie Manning. The Mannings arrived in Holly Springs shortly after the Civil War. Van had been a Confederate officer and lawyer. He was not from Holly Springs, but his wife Mary was. Van Manning built a successful legal career. He would serve as a U.S. representative from Mississippi from 1877 until 1883. Although the Mannings were financially successful, Mary was privately suffering from the loss of her infant son William in 1861. The loss of William had so much effect on Mary that she swore to never bury another child. 10 years after the death of William, in 1871, the Mannings had a daughter they named Mittie. She helped Mary recover from her loss of William. However, tragedy struck on April the 22nd, 1875, when 4-year-old Mitty passed away from an unknown disease. Mary was inconsolable. She refused to allow anyone to bury Mitty. Her husband agreed to build a sarcophagus on top of the ground. Mary was still not satisfied. She wanted to see the face of her daughter. Van had a hole cut in the sarcophagus with a metal slide over it so that she could see Mitty's face. But as the body began to deteriorate, Mary began to lose her mind, refusing to leave Mitty's grave. Van will eventually have Mitty's body buried, but left the sarcophagus as it was. Van and Mary Manning left Holly Springs, but the town continued to upkeep the little Mitty Manning's grave. We have now left Holly Springs and headed for Sanatobia. We're on our way to visit the grave of country music singer O.B. McClinton. O.B. Burnett McClinton was born April the 25th, 1940 in Sanatobia. McClinton was one of the first black country music singers, along with Charlie Pride, to reach the top 30 country hits with Don't Let the Green Grass Fool You and 15 other chart hits. Obie was raised on his parents' George and Mary's farm and ranch south of Memphis. He grew up with 6 brothers and sisters, picking cotton by day and listening to radio station WHBQ in Memphis and WSM in Nashville at night. He didn't like farm work, picking cotton and plowing, so in his teens he headed to Memphis to fulfill his dream of becoming a recording artist. After spending what money he had left by buying a guitar and food to eat, he soon realized becoming a recording star was much harder than he had thought. O.B. decided to go to his aunts, who lived in Memphis, who encouraged him to go back to school. He attended Hamilton High School in Memphis, and after graduating from Hamilton, where he had joined a singing group sponsored by radio station WDIA, he went to Rust College in Holly Springs on a musical scholarship. In 1966, O.B. graduated from Rust College and landed a job as a DJ with WDIA. Along this time, the Vietnam War was heating up, and O.B. decided to avoid the draft by enlisting in the Air Force. After service, McClinton began writing songs for artists such as Otis Redding and others assigned to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Then he became associated with Stax Records in Memphis. He became a staff writer and singer with 15 chart hits. O.B. became a country music star, like the gentleman he was. He was a husband to his wife, Joanne Bullard, and their 2 sons, Dale and Drex. Joanne was a stay-at-home wife, but she wrote several of the songs O.B. recorded. O.B. McClinton is buried in the Gravel Springs Cemetery outside Sanatobia in the Gravel Springs community. In 1986, when his career was going strong, O.B., along with his family and fans, learned that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Now, on September 23, 1987, O.B. Burnett McClinton passed away after a year-long battle with abdominal cancer. He was 47 years old. I spoke with O.B.'s sister, Clotilde Fitzpatrick. She stated that before O.B. passed, they discussed things that he wanted to do for the Gravel Springs community. It is her desire to build a community center in honor of her brother. I'm sure she would love to hear from OB's fans. We are now back on I-55 headed to Ridgeland, Mississippi, just north of Jackson. We're looking for the Parkway Memorial Cemetery located at 1166 Highland Colony Parkway. We're looking for the graves of Mary Ann Mobley and her husband Gary Collins. Mary Ann Mobley was known as Mississippi's daughter. She was born February the 17th, 1937 in Biloxi and raised in Brandon, a small town just outside of Jackson. She was born into an affluent family. Her dad, Robert, was a well-known Mississippi attorney, and her mother, Mary Ferris, was an insurance executive. She had one sister, Sandra. When Mary Ann graduated from Brandon High School, she enrolled at Ole Miss. During her years at Ole Miss, she became a majorette and joined the Chi Omega Society. In 1958, she graduated from Ole Miss and entered the Miss Mississippi contest and won. 3 weeks later, she was in New Jersey with a dress off the rack, walking down the runway of the Miss America contest.
Where is your home in Mississippi?
I'm from Brandon, Mississippi.
Brandon is near what other city?
It's a small town 10 miles east of Jackson, Mississippi. One of those if you blink, you miss it.
I see. How big is Brandon, by the way?
We have about 2,500 wonderful people.
Well, that's fine. Well, the Brandon Chamber of Commerce can take a bow there. Do you have a large family?
No, my mother discriminated and had only 2 girls.
2 girls. I don't think she discriminated at all. I think she did very well. I don't think this has one in it. Oh, yes, it does. Here is your question, Miss Mississippi. What is your favorite topic when with a young man for opening the conversation? I repeat, what is your favorite topic when with a young man for opening the conversation?
Well, I've read different articles that tell you how to get along with the opposite sex. And the first thing that they say is, get him to talk about himself. So the first thing I ask is, do you play football, or what sport are you interested in? And then if he doesn't say anything, then you say, well, what are your hobbies? And then you go down the line from there, and if you can't get him to answer you on any of those, then you're just quiet for the rest of the evening.
First runner-up, Joan Lucille McDonald, Miss Iowa, Miss America, Miss Mississippi. Congratulations, Miss Mississippi. Here is Miss America to crown our new Miss America for 1959.
Mary Ann Mobley will be the first contestant from Mississippi to win the title of Miss America. When the niece of author William Faulkner rushed into his library shouting, "My old Miss sorority sister, Mary Ann, just won Miss America," he laid his pen down and said, "Nice to know that someone has finally done something to put Mississippi on the map." Although Mary Ann was the first Miss America from Mississippi, she won't be the last. Here she is being crowned by 1958 Miss America, Marilyn Van Derber. The very next year in 1960, Mary Ann will crown Linda Lee Meade, her sorority sister from Ole Miss, the next Miss America. Mary Ann will go into acting after her reign as Miss America, playing roles on Designing Women, Different Strokes, where she replaced Dixie Carter, General Hospital, and will appear on The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Perry Mason, Mission Impossible, and Burke's Law, where she said, "These beautiful women made a fuss over Gene Barry." She will appear in movies such as The King's Pirate, The Legend of Custer, and For Singles Only, along with 2 movies with Elvis, Girl Happy and Harum Scarum. Elvis treated his fellow Mississippian like the lady she was and told her, "Mary Ann, someday I'll have a party that I can feel comfortable inviting you to." In 1966, she was in Three on the Couch with Jerry Lewis and Gary Collins.
Hear me, I tense up. Here is zoo, there zoo, everywhere zoo, zoo. Boom, over the head, pop, pop, pop. Then I'll be happy.
You need a psychiatrist.
One year later, she will marry Gary, the love of her life, in her hometown of Brandon. They'll remain married for 45 years until his death. It'll be her only marriage. Gary had been married once before, less than 3 years, to Susan Leachman Peterson. They had 2 kids, Guy and Melissa Collins. Gary and Mary Ann had 1 daughter. They named her Mary Chancey Collins. Gary had been a TV host, having his own hour-long show entitled Our Magazine in 1980. He also had guest appearances on Charlie's Angels, Jag, Fantasy Island, and others. Gary took Burt Parks' place as host of the Miss America pageant, and in 1989 he invited Mary Ann to join him. Mary Ann suffered from Crohn's disease for years and became an activist for improvement in treatment. In 2005, this shows Mary Ann and blues singer B.B. King in Encino, California, doing a fundraiser for B.B.'s new museum being built in Indianola, Mississippi. Mary Ann once described herself as a short girl with a round face, as round as a moon pie. In 2009, Mary Ann was told by doctors that she had stage 3 breast cancer. That same year, her mother, Ferris Holmes, passed away and was buried at the Parkway Funeral Home Cemetery in Ridgeland. Later, Gary passed away in 2012 in Biloxi from natural causes at the age of 74. He will also be placed here. As you come through the main gate, take an immediate left and go 100 yards and look to the left towards the street. You'll see Mary Ann's, her mother, and on the other side of her mother is Gary. Mary Ann and Gary had separated for a short time in 2010. His drinking was causing problems, so she filed for separation, hoping it would give him a reason to stop. She left California and returned to Mississippi to recuperate from cancer. They maintained homes in both places. He soon followed her to Biloxi, and they were living there when he passed. Gary Enos Collins was a man with a soft voice and a softer heart. After Gary's death, she returned to their home in Beverly Hills to be close to her daughter. On December the 9th, 2014, Miss America, actress and Mississippi's daughter, Mary Ann Mobley Collins, passed away at home with family from complications of breast cancer. She was 77 years old. Mary Ann's daughter stated that her mother had to buy an extra plot so she could have room to put a bench where people could come and sit and rest. Chances said it might be the first time for friends and family to get the last word with Mom. They don't call her the mouth of the South for nothing, she said. We're now on our way to the Oak Grove Baptist Church Cemetery in Meridian to see the grave of the blue yodeler Jimmie Rodgers. In 1982, Clint Eastwood starred in a movie called Honky Tonk. It was based loosely on the life of the singing brakeman Jimmie Rodgers. James Charles Rodgers was born in Meridian, Mississippi on September the 8th, 1897. Jimmie's parents was Aaron and Eliza Bowman Rodgers. He was the youngest of 3 boys. When Jimmie was 6 years old, he lost his mother to illness. He lived with his aunt for a while until his dad remarried. Then he returned home to live with his dad and his dad's new wife. Aaron, his dad, was a maintenance right-of-way foreman on the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. When Jimmie was old enough, his dad got him his first job as a water boy on the railroad crew. That's where he learned to strum a guitar from workmen and even hobos. Within a few years, he was promoted to brakeman on the New Orleans and Northeast Railroad. This was a position his older brother Walter held until Walter was promoted to conductor on the New Orleans and Meridian run. Jimmie was married twice. First, at the age of 17, he married Stella Kelly. They had 1 daughter. They divorced in 1919. The next year, in 1920, Jimmie married Carrie Cecil Williamson. They had 2 daughters, Anita and June. June only lived 6 months and passed away in 1933. During this time, Jimmie was singing and playing part-time while still working on the railroad. In 1924, at the age of 27, Jimmie was diagnosed with tuberculosis, or TB. He knew with TB he would not be able to continue working for the railroad. He decided to try making a living performing. In July of 1927, one of his band members told him that Ralph Peer, a representative of the Victor Talking Machine Company, was coming to Bristol, Tennessee to record local musicians. Jimmie's recordings that he made in Bristol had minimum success. So he goes back home and gets his sister-in-law, Elsie McWilliams, to help write songs for him. She will eventually write over 40 songs for Jimmie. He takes some of her songs and goes to Camden, New Jersey and records T for Texas. It becomes a huge country-wide success. Soon Jimmie Rodgers was a household name, with more money than he ever dreamed of. In time, his TB spread and doctors had to remove one of his lungs. He continued recording and making hits with only 1 lung, even recording a song about his disease called TB Blues. He moved to Texas, hoping the dry climate would help his disease. He built a mansion in Caryville. We have arrived at the Oak Grove Cemetery, and I'm walking up to Jimmie Rodgers' country music historical sign. I'll try, after showing his and Carrie's grave, what a quiet and peaceful graveyard it is. In May 1933, Jimmie was back in New York, staying at the Taft Hotel and recording several songs over several days. He had become so weak he had to lie down to rest between songs. A nurse would have to help him set up to record. One of his last recorded songs was Mississippi Delta Blues. After finishing the session, he was carried back to the hotel, and 2 days later, on May the 26th, 1933, 35-year-old recording artist Jimmie Rodgers passed away from complications of tuberculosis. His body was placed on a train and sent back home to Meridian. We're now on our way to the Hickory Grove Cemetery in Laurel. to locate the grave of Thomas William Lester, who played Eb Dawson on the TV show Green Acres with Eddie Albert and Ava Gabor. Lester appeared in every episode from 1965 through 1971, except for a few when he suffered from glandular fever. He beat out some 400 other actors for the part of Eb because he said he could milk a cow. He was raised in Laurel and attended Laurel High School, but he spent a lot of his time on his grandparents' farm, picking cotton, milking cows, and doing farm work. Tom, as he was called, is buried next to his parents, Pat, who was an accountant with Gulf Oil, and Mary Sue, who was a manager of a home interior and gifts. Hickory Grove Cemetery is a quiet and beautiful place to rest. As you come through the main gate, just go straight. For about 500 feet, Tom's grave will be on the left. Tom Lester played a simple-minded farmhand that loved hot water soup.
Drink your soup while the water is hot.
Nobody in their right mind would drink hot water soup.
I'm sorry I kept you waiting. Oh, boy, hot water soup.
Nobody in their right mind would.
That's what I said, and there's your living proof.
He actually held a degree in chemistry and biology from the University of Mississippi and taught school before going to Hollywood. He began acting at the North Hollywood Playhouse and became friends with Linda K. Henning that played Betty Jo on Petticoat Junction. Even though he was making good money on Green Acres and making appearances on numerous other TV shows, he lived a modest life and lived in a small apartment over a garage in the San Fernando Valley. After the end of Green Acres, Tom eventually ended up back in Mississippi on a 250-acre farm where he first started. In 2019, I went to the grave of Pat Buttram, who played Mr. Haney on Green Acres. Friends and family of Mr. Buttram said that Tom Lester would come to every festival that they had honoring Pat. They gave me Mr. Lester's phone number and said he'd be glad to talk to me. He is the kindest man, they said. I regret I never called him, but I didn't want to bother him because I had heard he was sick. In 2007, at the age of 68, Tom married actress Kaylee Lester. They had actually been going together several years before marriage. Kaylee and Tom lived happy on their farm for 12 years before he passed away in 2020 from complications of Parkinson's disease. Tom William Lester was 81 years old. We're now traveling on Highway 49 between Hattiesburg and Gulfport. We're looking for the grave of baseball great J. Hannah Dean, known to the baseball world as Dizzy Dean. Dizzy Dean is buried in Bond Cemetery in Bond, Mississippi, just north of Wiggins. We're stopping at the Dizzy Dean rest stop to get some statistics. After retiring, Dean spent time hunting and fishing with his many friends. Dizzy was born in 1910 in Lucius, Arkansas, to a poor farm family. He attended public school for 2 years, through the 2nd grade. He lost his mother at the age of 8. In 1929, while in the Army, Dean was pitching for Fort Sam Houston baseball team against the MLB Chicago White Sox. While striking out one batter after another, the exasperated Chicago managers yelled out, "Knock that Dizzy kid out of the box." The name Dizzy stuck. In 1930, he became a member of the pitching staff for the St. Louis Cardinals. Dizzy became the most dominant pitcher in the game. In 1934, he was joined by his older brother Paul, they called Daffy. Dizzy predicted that he and Paul would win 45 games in the 1934 season.
We ought to win 45 ball games this year. I think we will, Diz. You'll win 35. I'll take care of the rest. Nice going, boy.
He was laughed at as being a loudmouth and bragger, and it couldn't be done. Actually, they did better than 45. Dizzy won 30 and Paul won 19. Dizzy told the news media, "It ain't bragging if you can do it." In 1934 World Series, Dizzy was sent in as a pinch runner and got hit in the head from a throw to second base. He was knocked out, carried off the field, and spent the night in the hospital. The next morning, he said the newspapers reported X-rays of Dean's head showed nothing. In 1935, Dizzy said the Cardinals cut his pay. He asked the manager why, and he said, "Well, because you only won 28 games instead of 30. Dean's career was cut short in 1937. A line drive struck his big toe and broke it. He tried to return to playing too early and injured his throwing arm. He had won 13 games out of 14 when the toe was injured and never won another game.
What are you going to do to the Tigers, fella?
Well, I hope that I can beat them today. I think it's a great honor for me to pitch the opening day of the World Series of 1934.
Dean is regarded as one of the best pitchers in baseball history. He took 4 consecutive strikeout titles and led the National League in complete games, pitched for 4 straight seasons, and won 2 games for the Cardinals in 1934 World Series. His brother Paul won the other 2. Dean retired from baseball in 1947. Dizzy then became a radio and TV announcer as the voice of the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Yankees. His country ways and mispronouncing names endeared him to baseball fans. In the late 40s until 1965, Dean was the voice of CBS and NBC's Game of the Week. In 1952, Dan Daly and Joanna Drew starred in a movie, The Pride of St. Louis, about Dizzy and his wife, Patricia Nash Dean. In 1953, Dizzy Dean was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. After retiring, Dizzy and Patricia moved to Wiggins, Mississippi, where she was from. On July the 17th, 1974, J. Hannah Dean suffered a severe heart attack on Monday after complaining of chest pains the Thursday before while in Lake Tahoe, California. Dizzy Dean was 64 years old. We're now on our way to Smithville. We're looking for the Pierce Chapel Cemetery, trying to find the grave of Grand Ole Opry comedian Rod Brasfield. Rod Brasfield was born 1910 in Smithville. Rod was a permanent fixture on the Grand Ole Opry from 1947 until his death in 1958. Also in 1958, Rod became a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame. In 1944, he was asked to perform on the Grand Ole Opry by George D. Hayes, the solemn old judge. In 1948, Rod and Minnie Pearl formed a double comedy act where he didn't need a straight man. One would say something funny about the other, and then the other would say something funny about that one. That way, both had funny lines.
What's the trouble, Rodney? What's the trouble? I'm mad. What's the trouble? I'm just burned up. What's the trouble, Rodney? Well, look at this here note I got through the mail. I got that through the post office today. Read it there, what it says.
It says, Rodney Brasfield, stay away from my wife or I'll shoot you.
Yeah.
Rodney, what are you going to do?
Well, what can I do? The fool didn't sign his name.
Rod had an older brother named Lawrence Brasfield they called Boob. He was a comedian with Red Foley on the Ozark Jubilee. When Rod was old enough, he became a straight man for Boob. He did that until Boob missed a show, so Rod had to become the funny man. He liked telling jokes so much he struck out on his own. Boob's wife never took Rod's place as the straight man. And in 1931, Rob married Eleanor Humphreys. She was a Hohenwald, Tennessee school teacher. When he first started at the opera, he worked with a dummy for a while he called Bocephus. When Hank Williams Sr. heard the name, he began calling his son, Hank Jr., Bocephus. I remember in the early 50s when Grand Ole Opry stars came to our little town, they performed on a flatbed trailer. Minnie Pearl, Rod, Pete Powell, Red Foley, and others. Rod and his wife Eleanor was staying with Pete Powell, who lived close by. Pete's son Jimmie told me he remembered when Rod and Eleanor stayed with them when they came to Iuka to do a show. They lived in the country and remembered Rod saying to his dad, "Say, Pete, let's have a look at those fine-looking pigs you've got out there in your pen." Of course, they was looking for a way to get out from the wife and kids to take a drink of whiskey. Jimmie said every once in a while Rod would say, "Pete, let's have another look at those hogs." After several times of seeing the pigs, Eleanor told Rod, "Rod, if you don't stop going to see those pigs, you're going to be sleeping with them." In 1958, Rod Brasfield passed away in Martin, Tennessee, from heart failure. He was brought back to Smithville to be buried. Rod Brasfield was only 48 years old.